She is an associate professor of history and Jewish studies at Michigan State University. She is the author of American Dreams and Nazi Nightmares and the Betty Friedan, The Feminine Mystique, the critical edition. She's also the co-editor of the journal American Jewish History.
Thank you so much, Peter. And thank you all for inviting me. I should say that Peter and I have been discussing this for a really, really long time. I think you contacted me last year. So it is one of the benefits of the pandemic is that it actually made us all realize that it is easier to be in touch with people and to be able to communicate than we initially realized. So I appreciate it. This is also, it's in the background of Peter's screen, but I am also the author of Rosenberg by any other name. So I'm going to be speaking about that. I'm really looking forward to it. I'm going to share my screen now if I can. And I should say thank you to Dahlia Remler as well, and to Ray, who've been really helping with the technology, and I hope that it works. I'm really looking forward to seeing everyone, or not seeing you while I speak, but then being able to talk with you about my work. Am I going to be able to share my screen now? Okay, great. So I'm going to share my screen. There we go. Can everybody see that? Okay, I hope so. Because I can't hear everyone. Peter, can you unmute yourself? Tell me if you can hear me. Okay, great.
Yeah, very nice.
All right. Excellent. All right, great. So if this were a normal talk, and if I were there physically with you, I would be asking everybody in the audience how many people had a name-changing story of some kind in their family. Usually about half the room would raise their hand. If I ask if you have a friend who changed their name, another, sort of maybe 15% would raise their hand. And then I would ask, have you seen any name-changing stories or jokes? Do you know any good jokes? Do you know any, have you seen it in movies or read it in books? And almost everybody by the end has their hands raised. Name-changing, and the purpose of that is really to talk about the ways that name-changing can make us realize that name-changing is a really integral part of American Jewish culture and really American culture more broadly. There's anecdotes and jokes and folklore about name-changing all over the place. And what I think is really important and interesting about that is that those anecdotes and jokes have really shaped our cultural understanding of what it means to change your name. So much so that when I began doing this history, when I began doing my research, these were images that I had in my own mind. And so I'm going to sort of offer you three of them, three really popular images. Sorry, hold on one second. So, and I'm going to put this, I'm sorry, I apologize. I'm going to put this on the name changing on the screen so you can see better. So the first story comes from Edward G. Robinson's memoir, All My Yesterdays. As an immigrant from Bucharest, Romania, Robinson changed his name from Emanuel Goldenberg as an 18-year-old drama student. And he writes, "It was suggested to me, ever so tactfully, that Emanuel Goldenberg was not a name for an actor. Too long, too foreign, and I suspect too Jewish." And he writes, although the thought of changing it was unpleasant, somehow a denial of my beginning, somehow unfaithful to my mother and father and 5 brothers, he searched for a new American-sounding name and adopted his middle initial G as, quote, my private treaty with the past. So that's one story. And if you don't know Edward G. Robinson's specific story, my guess is that you know another movie star's story. And Peter and I talked about that beforehand. I think that movie star name changes really form a huge part of our cultural image of name changing. The second story is actually a pretty popular joke. Most of you probably know it. Again, if I were, in front of you, you could probably tell the story for me and even finish it for a lot of people. But since you can't, I will say it for everyone. A Jewish immigrant entered America at Ellis Island, is processed according to standard procedures. These were very confusing to him. He's overwhelmed by the noise and the bustle. And so when one of the officials asks him, "What is your name?" he replies, "I schon vergessen." In Yiddish, "I've already forgotten." And so the official then recorded his name as Sean Ferguson or Shane Ferguson, depending on your version of this story. And again, if you don't know that joke, and I have found huge numbers of people actually do know that joke, but if you don't know that one, you might know another one, right? There's a lot of jokes. Peter told me another one right before I started speaking earlier this afternoon. These kinds of jokes are all over the place in American culture. And then finally, the third story is actually a scene from the popular film Hester Street. I don't know if any of you have seen it, but usually a good number of people have seen it. It came out in the 1970s. It's a dramatization of the Abraham Cahan novel Jekyll. Jekyll is an immigrant who has been in the country for several years and has tried to do everything to shed his old world life. He calls himself Jake. He prides himself on his Yankee clothes and his knowledge of American culture and English language. Upon the death of his father, he sends for his wife and son, played here, you can see by Carol Kane, but he is embarrassed of them. He's embarrassed of their greenhorn status. He ultimately shuns his wife for a beautiful, more assimilated American Jewish woman. And his wife, Giddel, feels rejected and confused by his name change and by his desire to change the name of their child. So you may not know these particular stories, but I would imagine that at least one or two of them probably sound familiar to you. And although the stories are substantially different, they actually share one crucial similarity that I'd like to point out that I kind of realized. As I say, I went into the archives with these stories. And then when I went to the archives, I saw something so different that I realized something really similar about these stories. They all emphasize name changing as a profoundly individual activity. In the case of Edward G. Robinson, and all cases of movie star name changes, the name change is the act of an extraordinary individual, someone distinguished by talent or beauty or charisma. On the other hand, immigrant Sean Ferguson's name change was the result of profound isolation. His name was changed because he was a lonely individual with no understanding of or connection to his new culture, and because he had no one to turn to aid him in navigating the system, right? He's profoundly alone. And then finally, in Hester Street, and really a lot of stories of kind of, callow young men changing their names to make their way in America. Name changing is really about this kind of shallow young man who wants to just remake himself in the new world. All three of these stories suggest that name changing was an act entered into by individuals, isolated or escaping from or betraying Jewish families and the Jewish community. And so in contrast of these three popular stories of individual name changes, the things that have really, I think, shaped the way Americans and American Jews see name changing, I would like to offer you another, much more common story of name changing in America. And this is the story that I found in my archives. In 1932, a man named Max Greenberger petitioned the city court of the city of New York to allow himself, as well as two of his four children, to change their last name to Green. One of Greenberger's grounds for the petition was that the name Greenberger is a foreign-sounding name and is not conducive to securing good employment as a musician, which was the chosen profession of his daughter. Another ground was that the name Greenberger is not helpful towards securing an appointment as an intern in a hospital, the chosen profession of one of his sons. Greenberger's petition was one of thousands that was submitted in the middle of the 20th century to the New York City Civil Court. Men, women, and children, like the Greenbergers, legally changed their Jewish-sounding names to less ethnically identifiable ones. Really, between 19 teens, between World War I and really the 1960s. And until the 1980s, Jewish names were represented disproportionately among names being changed legally in New York City. Yet historians have not seriously studied the significance of name changing in American or American Jewish life. Scholars of American life have tended to take name changing for granted, to refer to its existence casually, in fact, the reason that my research was so shaped by these popular images was that there were no historical books about name changing. There were no historical articles about name changing when I went in to do my research, which is really incredibly unusual when you're an historian. Usually there's been something written. My book is actually the first in-depth historical work to be written about any group changing their name in the United States, even despite its importance in kind of our general folklore and culture. And I think that this is really crucial to think about because I think that by exploring the actual practice of name changing in more depth, we can really understand much more about the lives of American Jews. The fact that Max Greenberger was not a young single man seeking to escape his Jewish past and succeed in an elite non-Jewish world. And he was not a helpless immigrant caught by circumstances. And he was also not a movie star. He was a middle-aged father seeking to improve his family's economic status. And I really think that that illustrates the degree to which name changing was a voluntary group activity that was entered into by thousands of Jewish men, women, and children together. In the middle of the 20th century in New York City, name changing was a strategy of class mobility that Jewish families embraced in large numbers. Ironically, I'm just going to turn on some light as it gets dark in my room. Ironically, the strategy illustrated Jews' economic comfort in the United States. The Greenberger children were not searching for manual labor, right? They're looking for jobs as a doctor and a musician. But at the same time, it also illustrated Jewish weakness. An identifiable Jewish name was not helpful to securing good employment. Ultimately, name changing was a strategy that permitted Jewish families to attain and to strengthen their position in the American middle class. But that position, I argue, came at a psychological and a communal cost. So I want to just briefly sort of give you some introduction to the research that I did. I'm really happy to answer any more questions that you have about the ways that I did research. The bulk of my research was conducted in the Civil Court of New York City. I examined name change petitions from 1887 through 2012, so over a century of name changing. And I'm really happy to talk about sort of the process of research. Some of it was pretty interesting. I was, standing online with people changing their names today. I'm also happy to talk about my methodology, how I knew people were Jewish, how I didn't know people were Jewish. You can see, actually, I do have to confess that the image that I have here is not actually an image I personally found myself. This is an image that Peter Moniz shared with me of his late wife's, I believe, grandfather. And it's wonderful when families actually have these kinds of documents. It's pretty rare. I actually frequently in talks like this, I find more people asking me how I found this material and where to find it. It's really amazing to be able to find this and have this piece of history that I think a lot of people don't. And it's also really exciting for me to see people in their own personal collections have things that I, had to travel to New York for and look at in large numbers. It's important to note that I did look at other sources, not just these petitions. I also looked at the archives of Jewish organizations like the National Jewish Welfare Board and the American Jewish Congress. But the bulk of my findings were in New York City. You guys are a New York audience, so that might seem normal to you. But in fact, I had actually initially hoped to do a broader sort of comparative work looking at Detroit and LA and comparing them to New York. But I in part stuck with New York because actually I have to thank the deputy attorney of the city of New York who gave me access to all of these materials and allowed me to do the historical research that I was able to do, which you can't do for most name change petitions throughout the country. And so I'm really grateful to the New York City Civil Court for letting me do this research. But I also want to point out that I looked at thousands of documents. It took me a long time. I live in Michigan. And so another factor that encouraged me to look at the New York records was that I actually am from the New York area. I went to school at Columbia and NYU. I was born in New York, raised in New Jersey. My husband and I are both from New Jersey, New York area, and both my mother and my mother-in-law lived in New York. So when I started writing this, oh dear, that messed up. When I started writing this, it was 2007, and that was my son in 2007 on the left. He was 2 years old, and I could bring him with me be babysat by my mother-in-law and my mother, and still be able to see him at night, which is important when you're a researcher. This took, it took weeks and weeks to be able to go through all these materials, and I didn't want to leave him alone for so long. It's also worth noting that this is my son now, 13 years later, along with a daughter who showed up in 2010. This is to say the process of research takes a long time. It's difficult to do. I went through a lot to be able to get these materials. And so I think it's really kind of important to see it's a very long and time-consuming process. And this is partly why I chose New York, was to be able to aid me in doing that kind of research. The other point the other things that I'd like to make clear before I start giving you a little bit more explanation into my research, I do want to make clear that I'm talking about formal legal name changing. And that is it's an activity, a voluntary activity that differs greatly from many people's understandings of name changing and their assumptions about name changing, not just from kind of the cultural stories that I offered, but also from personal stories that people have heard from their families. Many individuals believe that their family names were changed at Ellis Island when their ancestors entered the country. However, most genealogists and immigration historians argue that this kind of mass involuntary name changing at Ellis Island simply did not take place. One of the major pieces of evidence for this actually comes, oh dear, I'm sorry. I put this here. I'll go back to that in a second. I'm sorry, I put my pictures in the wrong place. One of the major pieces of evidence for this derives actually from the actual process of Ellis Island processing. If you look at this picture more closely, I used this before as just illustration for Sean Ferguson. If you look more closely, you can actually see that the officials standing behind the desks have these very large pieces of paper, sort of books that they're looking at. Those are the ship manifests. Those have already been filled out beforehand. So when they are calling people up, the standard process for processing people at Ellis Island was to call them by name. There were translators there who would aid in sort of finding people's names, but you'd be called up by name. And then you can see this is actually what these manifests look like. And if you can actually see better than some people that would be able to see if you had been to my talk in person, there are check marks next to people's names, next to people's information. People would be checked off. So that kind of like joke, what is your name? And, you give any kind of a name, generally did not happen at Ellis Island. It certainly didn't happen in mass numbers at all. Moreover, immigrants didn't leave Ellis Island with any paperwork that bound them to a new name. American law gave officials no power to determine individuals' names. Ellis Island policy actually forbade it. It's maybe possible that a rogue inspector or two recommended, that's a terrible name, change it to something, that sounds better. Maybe they even wrote something different on an immigrant tag when they were detained at Ellis Island. Immigrants might have sort of interpreted that as some kind of message from the state. But there's really little to no evidence that there was mass, systematic, involuntary name changing at Ellis Island, like the kind that is frequently seen to be assumed by stories in people's families or jokes. And there's actually much more evidence of voluntary name changing in court and in naturalization petitions throughout the country. So rather than looking, historians go where the evidence is, right? So in general, there's generally really not much evidence of this kind of Ellis Island name changing. And instead what there is lots of evidence of people changing their names in city court. And so I'm going to talk about these court petitions. It's also important to note they're mostly submitted by second generation Americans rather than the naturalization petitions that were probably submitted by immigrants. And we can discuss that point more if you'd like to. I want to make the point that the official name changing that we're talking about, that people are doing when they make these court name changes, are typically growth or outgrowths of the modern state in the 20th century. While you have immigrant memoirs filled with stories of unofficial name changing, right? People choose names quickly and easily, on the shop floor, in their neighborhood, with friends, with families. That happened constantly to people in the early part of the 20th century. It's only as a growing government bureaucracy in the 20th century began to track individuals to pay taxes, serve in the military, receive welfare benefits, that name took on social, political, and economic significance. And so that actually gets us to three arguments that I want to make for you today. I want to argue that name changing is going to explode. Actually, that's let's see. Here we go. I'm actually going to move on past those arguments. I'm going to argue that name changing explodes during the 1930s and the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s because of World War I, World War II, and the growth of the Depression state. I'm also going to argue that this has significant impact on individuals' daily lives. Between 1917 and 1945, Jews erasing Jewish names represented a high percentage of name change petitioners in New York City, well out of proportion to their actual numbers in the city. And I think that's actually a really interesting point to think about. Because you might think, well, New York City has tons of Jews, right? And so if there's lots of Jews changing their names, that makes sense because there was lots of Jews in New York City. But in fact, it's really disproportionate compared to Jews' existence in the city. The numbers of Jewish petitioners in the pool of the name change petitioners was about 50%, somewhere between 50 and 60% of the name changers. The Jewish population in New York City was at its highest, about 25 to 30%. And so clearly they're double their population in the city. And it's even greater if you account for the fact that most name change petitioners lived in Manhattan, where there really only about 14 to 17% of the population was Jewish during this time. So Jews are being represented in these petitions well beyond their population. And really significantly as well, no other ethnic group came close to Jews' numbers in abandoning ethnic names during those years. So, for example, in 1942, the total number of petitions submitted by people with Slavic, German, Italian, and Greek surnames, all of those names, for people looking to erase those kinds of names, they equaled about half of Jewish petitions submitted for the same purpose. So this gives us a sense of how extensive Jewish presence is in these petitions. And the presence of so many Jews, I want to repeat, as I said before, really reflects the economic strength of Jews. And I'm going to go back to this for a second. It really reflects Jewish success. New York State did not require that you file legal petitions. It only required that you show that you're not trying to commit fraud and the new name is legally yours. So in part, this is showing greater educational and economic opportunities for Jews in the middle of the 20th century, right? If you don't have to actually officially change your name, then who's going to change their names? At that moment, it was middle-class people who decided to change their names officially. That is in part, it is a middle-class strategy because in part it is expensive to change your name. It can cost in the hundreds of dollars, what would be equivalent to the hundreds of dollars in today's money. You required legal fees, you required to place an ad in the newspaper and all kinds of things. But even more subtly and more significantly, in the first half of the 20th century, it was primarily white-collar workers and businessmen who worried that somebody might be scrutinizing their names. If you had a working class job, Let's say you were a domestic servant or you were loading cargo. You were frequently going to get your job based on somebody looking at your body and deciding that you were strong enough or big enough to be able to do the work that you needed. It was middle class people, secretaries applying to employment agencies, businessmen seeking clients, students seeking to get into schools. They are the ones who need to change their names because they're the ones who need to put their names down on an application form. And it is Jews who are the recent immigrants who have moved at this moment in large numbers from blue collar to white collar work by the time of the Depression, who are the most recent immigrant group with the most money available to them, not only to file name changing petitions, but to be worried about what their names looked like on an application form. As this argument that I have up here suggests, however, at the same time, the fact that roughly 50% of name change petitioners were Jewish in the 1930s and the 1940s strongly suggests that pervasive anti-Semitism was limiting Jewish opportunities for employment. So I'm going to move past some of those arguments, and I'm going to talk a little bit about anti-Semitism. So this is an image that I show a lot of my students, and I show whenever I talk to an audience. If you were an audience and I were there, I would ask you what you saw. You can see not only that the help wanted ads are divided by male and female, but if you look closely, you can also see that it was not illegal in 1931 in New York to advertise that your bank teller needed to be Christian, to advertise that your college grad who was going to be an accountant would be a Protestant, that your security guard would be a Christian, that your floorman would be a Christian. All of these things were completely legal and the norm. As more Jews entered white collar work, they found increasing barriers to their employment, right? So as Jews are entering the middle class, it is just then that employers say, we don't want all these Jews taking our jobs, right? According to one 1937 report, 89% of large New York companies declared that they, quote, preferred Christians as employees. Employment advertisements like the ones you see increasingly note their employers are Christian, or they might say Anglo-Saxon, or they might identify themselves as a Christian firm. And employers would routinely use names found on application forms to identify and exclude Jews. Journalists in the 1930s reported that employment agencies and employers would, look at a name, keep you waiting if it sounded sort of Jewish, and get rid of you entirely if they assumed that yours was a very Jewish sounding name. As this is happening in employment, at the same time, maybe even a little bit earlier, colleges begin to pioneer a system of quotas against Jews. So if you look at this image closely, and you have the benefit of being able to see it much closer than usually my public audiences can, you can see I've shown you John F. Kennedy's application to Harvard University in 1935. So the universities don't like to share this kind of their application forms. They don't like to show it to you, I think in part because in the 19-teens, beginning with Columbia, and then being made public by Harvard in the 1920s, and then spreading to universities throughout the country, and especially on the Northeast, universities began to limit the numbers of Jews they accepted during these years. And they did so by pioneering the forms that you see before you. If you can see, they asked John F. Kennedy what his father's name was in full, when and where his father was born. If his father was not born in America, had he been naturalized, his father's occupation, his mother's maiden name in full. These applications stretched to 8-10 pages, and they were completely constructed in order to keep out Jews. Those application forms, and students understood that, right? These were brand new forms. The form before these existed in the 19-teens actually was a half page long and asked you nothing other than what your current address was and what you'd gotten on the Regents exams and what kind of scores you had for your senior year, basically. Right? This begins a process of trying to figure out who the Jews are. And they, in their private notes, they were quite open and explicit about the fact that they were studying their Jewish populations, trying to figure out what kinds of information would identify them as Jews, and using that information to mark and identify them as Jews. And so you can imagine that this is the kind of environment that Jewish students, young Jews in their teens, in their 20s, even in their 30s and 40s, this is the environment that people are living in. There are increasing numbers of applications that are studying them, isolating them either for their names or their decision to name change, right? And so they are looking for some kind of official way to identify themselves as not having these kinds of markers that would exclude them. And you can see in my petitions, lodged at the New York City Civil Court, all the petitioners describe, they hint at the forces of anti-Semitism that are limiting their lives. So Dora Sarietsky in 1937 was a stenographer and typist who testified that my name proved to be a great handicap in securing a position. In order to facilitate securing work, I assumed the name Doris Watson. Bertram Levy, who was president of a mail chute corporation in 1932, said that he had found his name has been a hindrance to him in his efforts to gain an entrance to various firms and to secure business from them. Right, a lot of this language is very veiled, but they are clearly making it known that they cannot find work with their actual names. And so they are looking to change their names. Bertram Levy changed his name to Bertram Leslie. A few of the petitions that are there, and only a few, speak openly of the anti-Semitism of the era. They are ironically non-Jewish. So a man named Julius Kaminsky, for example, petitioned the court to allow him to change his name to George Joseph Cayley because he said, although he was a Hungarian Roman Catholic, employers consistently assumed that he was a Jew, making it hard for him to keep a job. While petitioner has the highest respect for people of the Jewish race, he finds that other people in the city of New York have not that respect, and that a good many employers under whom he has worked have discriminated against the against the Jewish race. Another Roman Catholic man named Leo Goldkopf claimed that his family and family members had urged him to file a petition to change his name to Leo Dawson because of his difficulties finding jobs. I've had many opportunities of obtaining employment in organizations where Christians were preferred, but my name precluded favorable consideration of my application. Upon occasions, friends of mine declined to give me a written recommendation solely on the ground that my name would make it impossible to obtain the position in question. And here you can see he's made these people are making clear and really shedding a light on the anti-Semitism that shrouded many Jews' efforts to find jobs and integrate into the military. And I'll talk about the military later. That anti-Semitism affected the language of Jews' name change petitions to the court. So petitioners, as you saw before, most petitioners are using veiled legal language that evaded most discussion of anti-Semitism or discrimination. You saw that Dora Sarietsky and Bertram Levy did not say anything about anti-Semitism. And many Jews just kind of used formulas. Employers found my name difficult to pronounce, spell, and remember. It's pretty interesting, I think, and maybe people want to talk about the fact that people who identify themselves as Catholic, and they of course might not have been telling the truth, but people who identify themselves as Catholic are pretty clear that it's anti-Semitism. And so the fact that Jews are uncomfortable talking about it, I think, kind of indicates the extent to which that anti-Semitism has kind of permeated their lives, and that they're not really, they feel that they are uncomfortable even talking about the ways that it has shaped their lives. Some Jews talked about their name names being foreign sounding, or asked the court to grant them permission to use an American name, even though clearly they're all American. 75% of them are native-born Americans. And it's true that a lot of this kind of vague legal language is constructed by judges or lawyers who are looking to appeal to judges' standards. But the fact that large numbers of Jewish men and women use this kind of vague terminology of foreign or difficult to pronounce, while Catholic men are much more comfortable detailing specific discrimination, suggests kind of the level of discomfort that Jews are facing, and maybe even their feelings of shame that they're experiencing these kinds of discrimination. Let's see, excuse me, let me go back here for a second. The petitions at the New York City Civil Court illustrate not only the anti-Semitism that affected Jews' economic lives in the middle of the 20th century, but they also demonstrate the ways that Jews responded to that anti-Semitism by changing their names in family units. Large numbers of petitions filed by Jews involved families, just like the Greenbergers, either parents filing for underage children, spouses filing with one another, adult siblings filing with one another, and entire family units, really, with adult parents and minor children filing petitions. Women, and this was a surprise, if you notice, none of the examples I gave you were really about women, but women regularly engaged in name changing with their husbands, brothers, and fathers, and sometimes on their own as well, frequently when they themselves were seeking jobs, like Dora Sarietsky. Even when a man was the sole petitioner to change his name, his wife had to file an affidavit of consent allowing the change, suggesting that this is not men escaping their wives. They are doing it in concert with their wives. And children were consistently the key subjects in name change petitions. It was not at all unusual for parents to change their children's names while keeping their own names. Many of the petitions emphasized that petitioners wanted to maintain a store with a family name intact. And I've had, actually, when I've given public talks, a lot of people will tell me that was the case in their family. Others, like Max Greenberg, expressed hopes that their children might have a better chance of finding a job or entering professional school. Name changing was a family strategy. In general, all members of a family were part of one economic unit, and they filed name change petitions together to encourage that unit to thrive. And indeed, name changing was so significant for families' survival and advancement that men and women who wanted to change their names frequently reported that family members had already done so, and they were embarrassed by the lingering reminder of the old name in the family. So 33-year-old David Pelowitz, for example, noted that all of his brothers had already changed their names legally. And quote, that the fact that your petitioner has not changed his name to Pello has frequently caused embarrassment to his brothers and to other members of the family. So this is important. I mean, I really see this as a phenomenon. It is a phenomenon that is taking place. Jewish families are doing this together. It is well known that this is happening, right? And people are really doing it together. They're talking about it. They're thinking about it. They're consulting with one another. But it's important to note that even if it's a group activity that's entered into by Jewish families, it was not necessarily a universally embraced Jewish group activity, however. Several petitioners specifically affirmed their Jewish identity, suggesting that they were concerned about what Jewish readers of the petition might think of their decisions to change their names. So in 1932, traveling salesman Lawrence Lipschitz, for example, insisted that although he wanted to change his name to Lipson, he, quote, does not intend or desire to deny his faith, but is perfectly willing, and in fact is known, and it is petitioner's intention to be known as a Hebrew. Similarly, lawyer Eugene Martin Greenberg made clear in 1942 that his desire to change his name to Eugene Martin Grant was in order to, quote, enhance his opportunities for social and professional advancement. He does not intend to forsake the Hebrew religion of his family. And so it's interesting, why are these petitioners kind of highlighting this and emphasizing this? They're not saying they're changing their name for anti-Semitism, but they want to make sure that it's clear that they're not abandoning Judaism or the Jewish community. And I think we might find reason for that in the fact that there were Jewish judges, a few, who did indeed reject the petitions of Jewish name changers, or they at least soundly scolded them for what the judges perceived as betrayal. So Judge Aaron J. Levy of the New York Supreme Court, for example, granted Everett Levy's petition to change his name to Leroy, but chastised him angrily for his pursuit of economic gain. He is wholly ignorant of the fact that the Bible tells us that the tribe of Levi never worshiped the golden calf. Let his application be granted so that his people might well be rid of him. And another judge, Louis Goldstein, outright rejected Brooklyn salesman Louis Goldstein's petition to change his name to Golding. The judge's own success, he stated, disproved the petitioner's claim that the name Goldstein was un-American, not euphonious, and an economic handicap. Understandably, one scholar noted that Jewish name change petitioners attempted to avoid having their petitions heard by Jewish judges.
Kirsten?
Yes.
Just to give you a little heads up, we're looking at the cuckoo clock and just giving you a heads up that we have questions coming, and just letting you know, everyone else, that we're coming to the Q&A very soon.
Okay, well, do you want me to stop here? I mean, I was going to go on and talk about World War II, but I actually don't have to. If you'd like me to stop here, I can just stop here and ask questions. I apologize. I should have told you I was unable to find my phone before the talk started.
No,
the screen takes up my phone, so I actually don't know what time it is. So if you would like me to stop here,
I think on the periphery of World War II is a great place to stop, because it's a great foundation. Maybe we'll have you another time for what happens after.
No, that's fine.
And I think the questions may actually answer some of your next part. So if you don't mind, we can start looking at questions.
That's
so
totally
let
fine.
me just.
I was going to move to I was going to move here just to give you some conclusions to walk away with.
Okay, well, if you want to do a quick.
Okay. This is all. We can just end it like that.
Okay, if you want to make a conclusion.
That's the conclusion. There you go.
The conclusion is?
Name changing is not a joke. Even though I like jokes, it's been a significant part of American Jewish life. And anti-Semitism has shaped American Jewish life more than scholars or most Americans have commonly acknowledged. So there you go.
Well, with that in mind, I just want to stop and thank you for your whole family helping out. It's a family business, I see.
That's right, exactly.